All right. Uh, Welcome everyone to today's webinar on the Frends integration platform. And just making sure before we get started, is everyone able to hear me correctly? If so, could someone please say something in the chat just to make sure? So I'm showing the chat screen here. So if someone could just confirm that my voice is actually coming through. Perfect. So that means that we can get started. Great. All right. So welcome everyone. Today's agenda or the subject of the webinar is hybrid integrations and this sort of a multi-cloud integration setup using Frends. And what we're going to be going through today is a little bit of a reminder on the architecture of Frends here in the beginning. So kind of how we are achieving this sort of a hybrid or a multi-cloud setup in actual real life scenarios, and how does the Frends architecture kind of support that. And afterwards, we're going to be going through a simple example. So basically building an example integration where we're passing data in this sort of a hybrid setup between basically my home computer or my home PC, which I'm using to present the webinar here, and then a cloud service or a cloud agent that we are running on Azure at the moment. But that's that, and let's get started on the actual webinar. You probably remember from the previous webinars or the documentation or wherever you've actually come across Frends that we're using the agent architecture here in Frends. And just as a kind of a reminder, what does that actually mean? So that means that when we are using Frends for any sort of integrations, we basically have two architectural components that actually matter. So the first one would be the control panel, so the user interface we're going to be using in the demo in a little while. So basically the dedicated tenant that all of you have, which is usually located in the cloud under your kind of customer tenant name .frendsapp.com. But you must probably also remember that in the user interface or in the control panel, we don't actually execute any integrations, even though we do all the development work, monitoring, governance, and things like that. So all the human interaction is kind of bundled inside the control panel, but the actual integration kind of flow and integration process executions don't happen in the control panel or don't happen in the cloud service that we are providing to you. But instead, what we're doing is attaching the kind of remote integration runtimes that we are calling agents to that control panel or to that central user interface. And we're using the control panel to tell each agent what sort of integrations they should be doing or running. And that's the kind of deployment procedure that we've gone through in previous webinars and in previous documentation quite thoroughly. So we don't go into too much detail on that side at the moment. But the interesting bit here is that if we imagine that we have a scenario now that we have, let's say, an AWS cloud environment set up somewhere, and we have some systems, microservices, whatever, located in the cloud environment, but we also have, let's say, an Azure cloud environment set up in Azure, and we have a different set of systems or data that we would like to use in our integrations. And additionally, we have a ground environment or an on-premise environment where we have yet another set of systems or data or services there. And these sort of three areas, or I would say three environments, so two cloud environments, and of course these cloud environments can be anything in addition to the on-premise or ground environment, kind of make up our whole integration landscape. And now, of course, the tricky bit here is that how do we get Frends to actually now pass data securely and kind of through the central control unit from basically one agent to another. And if we can actually achieve this, and that's what we're going to be taking a look at in just a while, how to do this correctly using Frends. But the main ideology behind here is that now when we can actually go ahead and put the agents in any of the kind of big three public cloud providers, and additionally on the on-premise environment as well, we can start creating these sort of integration flows, which actually can start in any point of the bigger picture or the integration environment as a whole. And we can actually model our integration flow or integration process in such a way that a portion of the data or processing happens in our chosen environment, and then we're transferring the execution to another environment or another agent within the big picture. And that agent is then able to utilize some of the information or data that we got from, let's say, the AWS Cloud Agent here, and use that information to, for example, write a query towards our data warehouse or create a file or anything of the sort. And to kind of maybe further clarify and recap on this a little bit as well. So how does this all work inside Frends? So you might remember that when we're using the agent architecture or the distributed architecture here in Frends, the agent is actually something that we can install either as a Windows or a Linux service in basically any of the cloud providers or in the ground environment, or as a container in a managed service. So for example, Azure offers us Azure Kubernetes service, and we could host the agent there in the cloud format. And what's actually happening when we are doing the development work here within Frends is that there's the Azure Service Bus queue to which all the agents we have installed now in our kind of integration environment or integration landscape are connected to that one central Azure Service Bus queue, and they're using the queue to communicate with the central control panel, and then of course with the agent. So that's the kind of channel of communication that we're going to be using here also, and that's the kind of channel that Frends is actually packaging and kind of abstracting away, so you don't need to actually implement any sort of kind of service bus connections or manage the service buses yourselves when Frends is actually doing all of that for you. So what's actually happening if we are creating this sort of a hybrid integration setup where we're able to pass data from one agent to another is that the agent which is actually sending data to another agent is connecting to the same queue that the control panel is using to communicate with the agent anyway. And that means that the agent is simply writing a message now to the service bus queue, and then we have another agent which actually knows that, all right, this message that, for example, the AWS Cloud Agent now wrote to the queue, the ground environment agent knows that, aha, I'm actually supposed to pick up that message. So they're subscribed to the queue and actually are then able to trigger the kind of further processing required here in the ground environment. And of course, this can kind of keep on going and going and going. So the ground agent could then do some processing, retrieve some data from a data warehouse or another system, and actually respond now with another message that could then actually go through the same queue system back to the original cloud agent, which actually started the processing here. And this is now kind of a really important bit here to understand as well, is that why we are doing something like this is that if we look at the same picture from a little bit of a kind of a different perspective here also almost. So if you remember in Frends where we model all of the integration flows using this BPM and then notation, the hybrid kind of executions that we were talking about here, where we're able to pass data between agents, is actually modeled directly in the integration flow itself. So that means that whenever we're doing some sort of integration flow processing, which would usually be kind of confined to a single agent. So this whole integration process usually would run in a confined space within the kind of framework of a single agent installed or distributed somewhere. Now, the hybrid capability gives us the option of actually choosing that, all right, these two components, or the read file component or task or step in the integration flow, that's actually something that the first portion of the process is something we want to, for example, start and run here in the ground environment. And then when we're moving on to the rest of the process, we can just simply detect or clarify during development for the integration process that, aha, after the first step, I want you to transfer the execution of the integration flow to another agent within the same environment in Frends, where we've set up this sort of a hybrid environment with multiple execution endpoints distributed across cloud services and ground operations and things like that. But what's actually happening there, kind of behind the scenes also even, is that when the data is being passed from, for example, the read file contents task or step in the integration flow to the next step in the integration flow, all of the kind of queue processing, so the message which would now here contain the contents of the file, is now actually inside or between these two steps is actually now being written to the queue, kind of like what we discussed here. So it's being written to the central queue, and then the other agent, which we have determined that which agent should actually now continue the integration, is then reading the contents of the file, so reading the message from that Azure Service Bus queue, and then continuing on with the integration. So even though the actual integration execution code, so the code that we're executing behind each of the integration steps or tasks is split between multiple different locations, we are using the Azure Service Bus queue to pass data between the different kind of shared code base of the agents we have installed in the bigger framework of things. And this is basically the scenario that we're going to be kind of going through next. So building up an integration where we would be able to actually utilize an agent now hosted in Azure Cloud, use that to connect to a web service basically to retrieve some data, and then create an integration flow where that data is actually passed through the queue to a ground agent or an on-premise agent, which is currently installed on my local PC here, and use that data from the cloud web service to then actually write a file and see how we can kind of get that working. And the whole ideology, of course, or why should we be doing something like this, is that because we have the agent already in place, or we usually have all the agents already in place in wherever setup we need them. So they might be in the cloud services or on-premise environments. And when we've kind of during installation, we've of course had to have made sure that the agent does have connectivity towards the central control panel. So that's kind of already been taken care of, and that kind of allows us to have this sort of a single managed secure connection between basically the different agents through the kind of central control panel. And this is kind of hugely helpful, for example, in the cases where, let's imagine in an on-premise setting, we have a firewall or strict firewall rules that writing directly from the cloud agent, for example, towards the on-premise environment would require us to open all sorts of ports and do kind of authentication and kind of run through all of those hoops there. But if we utilize the sort of hybrid approach here, where we would be able to actually pass the data through the queue instead of a direct connection between the two different kind of execution points here, that helps us a lot along with basically management and kind of securing connectivity. And also as an added bonus here there, you probably remember that it's much simpler and easier from a security perspective, and of course much more secure because when we're utilizing the Azure Service Bus queue to pass the data from the cloud to the ground, that means that all the agents only need to be able to connect outwards. So that means that no incoming kind of connection ports or rules or firewalls or things like that need to be configured, since it's only an outgoing connection towards this kind of central queue where then each agent is able to pick up the messages that they need to continue on with their execution. But all right, let's move on to the actual kind of demo in Frends now and kind of see what we're actually, or build the example that we're going to be going through here. So what I'm going to be doing next here is, or first here is actually just model out the kind of process that we want to be creating here with Frends, and kind of move on from there. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to name this to be something like demo hybrid dad joke to file process. I'm going to give it version 1.0.1 and a small description of this process reads a dad joke from a web service and passes that dad joke to another agent, which then writes that joke to a file. So that would be basically our example use case that we're going to be going through here. And of course, now the steps that we need to take or do here in Frends is that I would say that the first step, of course, would be to get our dad joke. And I'm going to document this a little bit here as well, because I like decent documentation. And just as an example, we're going to be using this very cool service here, which basically just generates random dad jokes, such as it was raining cats and dogs the other day. I almost stepped in a poodle. Haha. So funny. But basically, what we want to be doing is getting a new random dad joke and then just collecting them in files, so we can start building this sort of a dad joke library, even if we feel something like that. But basically, what we want to do is get the dad joke from that icon has dad joke service, and the next step would then, of course, be to pass the dad joke to the on-premise agent. And after we've kind of passed through, so basically what we want to be doing here is first start this execution of the integration flow in any of the other agents we have installed. And after the kind of retrieval of the dad joke, so calling a web service here in the public interweb, now we want to actually pass the data to the on-premise agent and write that to a file. So the last and third step of our example here should be something like write the dad joke to a file. And pretty much that would be the kind of core of our example process here. But how do we now actually kind of make this happen in Frends? So how do we actually get from the kind of definition and the ideology here to the point that we can have the data moving between the different agents, and we can actually get the files or dad jokes files to generate on our on-premise environmental setting here. So the first thing to do here is that you probably also remember that we utilize what we are calling this sort of a mini service, kind of a functional architecture here in Frends. And what that means is that in addition to actually modeling the different steps of the integration flow, what we want to also do is actually package the different data sources and kind of functionalities, integration endpoints even, in what we're calling these sort of low-code mini services. And the ideology behind there is that the mini service would be this sort of a, you can even almost think of it as like a connector or a reusable functionality to access some data or service or endpoint in a specific location. So, and the specific location here is really important. So what we want to utilize the mini services for in our example here is to actually build now a mini service which would allow us to receive any sort of a dad joke and then write that dad joke to a specified file on the specified location. And in the context of Frends, when we want to actually create this sort of a mini service, that the creation of the mini service is what allows us to now do the data passing between the different endpoints here. And that's basically because of the kind of architectural design decisions we've had with Frends, which mean that when we package the kind of call or the sort of reusable functionality in the form of the mini service, then the mini service is something that's that can actually listen to the queue to actually receive the kind of data or the file that the other agent is actually now sending. So the mini service is kind of the key component here in Frends, which enables us to kind of start the data passing between the different agents in the environment that we have. And the mini service basically equivalates in Frends to a sub-process, because we have our process here, and what we want to actually do here is have the dad joke retrieval part here be part of the main process, but then create the mini service or the sub-process for the on-premise portions of our execution. So even though I built our process here to kind of showcase and show how the process flow will actually go through, we also need to create now a sub-process component to deal with the writing of the file to our on-premise system or environment. And how do we actually achieve that is fairly straightforward as well. So we go onto our subprocesses view here and simply create a new subprocess. And you're probably familiar with the concept of, or should be familiar with the concept of subprocesses from previous webinars or our documentation. But pretty much you can think of the kind of subprocess in this context now as a component that we can have deployed anywhere on our environment. And what the component is doing in our case now is basically receiving contents of a file and the name of the file that we actually now want to write those contents into. So because of that, I'm going to be calling our subprocess component, I'll call it file create, let's say, new dad joke as an example there. And basically what that means is that now in the trigger of the subprocess we're creating, and if we remember, keep on our minds that now what we want to be doing is creating a component that can receive the data of the file content, so the dad joke in this case, and also the file name. So that means that because we are doing or basically creating two parameters for our component, we need to add two parameters here to our trigger of the subprocess. So firstly, I'm going to call this to the kind of file content, which is now the kind of incoming content of the file that we're going to be utilizing later down the line here when we're further kind of creating our process. And I'm going to just this is a dad joke. Just give us an example there and a small description saying that this is the contents of the file to be written when called by a main process, like so. And it's also always really good practice to actually put in the default values and descriptions. And you could even set the file contents to be something if you don't want that to be logged. So if you're, for example, passing data from on-premise to the cloud or cloud to on-premise, and there's some sensitive data, such as like the payload of a salary file or something, something you don't want to be logged when the execution happens, you can actually even set the whole file contents or the parameters to be secret, which means that then the contents won't actually be logged, and no one will be able to access the actual file content of the subprocess component we're creating here. But of course, in addition to the file content, we also need the file name. So that would be the name of the file we want to create, and the default value could be something like dad joke and unique, let's call this id.txt, just as an example there of what that's supposed to be like. So now that we have our kind of parameters set up for what we want to do with our subprocess, or basically our kind of remote executable for the creation of the file or the hybrid execution, then we'll basically implement the functionality we want behind the subprocess component here, just as we would when we would be creating a normal process. So what I'm going to be doing there is simply pretty simply just calling the Frends file write task and configuring that to now basically write the file to wherever I want that. So in this case, what we're going to be looking for is a folder I have set up here locally on my PC called basically temp and in. So I'm going to say that the path to our file is always in that say temp in folder. And what I also want to do now is actually take the file name that we want to create. So the file name that we also added as a parameter here, and add that in the path of the file that we want to be writing. So that means that I'm basically just going to be referring back to the trigger definition and select the file name portion there. And also if I wanted to, I could do something like add extra notation here to supplement my file name or whatever of the sort that we actually want to happen there. And then simply just the same thing that we want to do for the content of the file. So we want to say that we want to actually now execute or basically pick up the content of the file from the same trigger data. So that means that the trigger data is now the reference to the actual contents of the file we're going to be using to call. We're going to be using calling this subprocess component, which is then going to be written into the file in the first step. And I'm going to supplement this a little bit by saying that write, let's call it this dad joke, to a specified file like so. And that's pretty much it for the first part. But of course, in real life scenarios, when you're working with sub processes or anything of the sort, you probably will become, or those will probably become quite a bit more, I would say, kind of complicated than what we currently have here. So of course, we have processes that can actually implement a whole lot of integration functionality. But it's good practice to try and keep the sub processes or mini services that we're creating here kind of as atomic as possible. So you don't want to put too much functionality inside the sub process, because then that hugely kind of reduces the reusability of the processes itself. So wrapping things like an SMS message sending, or writing a file, or calling a web service, or executing a query to a database, all of these things are good examples of keeping the sub processes nice and atomic and nice and reusable for us in many different cases. But now, if we're kind of happy with our sub process, which would be writing a file, I also, of course, want to kind of test this out, so make sure that everything is working as it should be. So I'm just gonna now actually select my own home PC here as the agent I want to execute this in. And just as a brief clarification, we are now running in the development environment, but we're going to be executing our example here between Azure and now my home PC, and they've of course been named. So the Azure portion here is the cloud test agent, and Asmon Kotikone here is gonna be the PC, or the represent the on-premise situation for this hybrid call in this case. So I'm just gonna now select my home PC here and make sure that this is a test file, and make sure that I can actually now write the file, and I have all the correct rights to actually execute this, since now I do have the Frends agent running here on this machine, on this PC. And if we actually go ahead and take a look at it, it should be showing as running. So that means that we should have all the capabilities to actually now test this out and see that can we actually write a file using the subprocess or not. So just briefly, I'm just gonna call this foo.txt and run it once. And what that means is that if everything goes according to plan and everything is kind of working, we should end up with the foo text file here, which should have that this is a test file, content of the file there. So that means that our writing of the file is working as it should. So I'm fairly happy with the subprocess, and fairly confident now that the process will be able to actually write the files that I need. So I'm going to save changes to my subprocess component here, which now is now listed on the subprocesses view under basically the name that you generated here. And usually you would be also, of course, able to see the kind of all the other processes, or kind of main processes, which are using the subprocesses. But of course, because we just created our first subprocess component here, there is no other process yet using it. So that's why we'll go back to the main process side of things now, and actually now open up our example of our hybrid dad joke process we created. And now what we need to do is actually modify our process here a little bit, because if our steps basically looked like this, now what we are actually doing here is bundling and configuring the passing of the data to the on-premise agent automatically when we're calling the sub-process, and then the sub-process is actually handling writing the dad joke to a file like we just tested out in the previous example there. So what I'm going to do next is actually delete these two steps in the process and replace them with a call to the create new dad joke component we just utilized. So I'm going to plop that down right next to our get our dad joke process. And you can, of course, now see the example data we passed here for our file content and our file name. But this in and of itself is now not enough, because by default you can use the sub processes or the mini services kind of internally within the same agent as well. And if I want to now do the passing of the data between the different or two different agents, and particularly at this step in the integration flow, I need to actually enable that by clicking or enabling the remote call under the advanced settings for our mini service component. So I need to go in and actually enable the remote call functionality. And I, of course, need to now specify the maximum timeout that the execution of my on-premise component is allowed to do. Because what that means is that the functionality now inside our sub-process execution here, so the writing of our file, that's now being executed outside of the process context, which is now the kind of bigger picture here. So that means that we need to provide some way of actually for the cloud agent here that's kind of managing the instance of the process to tell them how long they should wait for the response message from the agent that we specify will be actually executing the cloud or the on-premise portion of the execution. So what that actually means is that I'll set that to be, in our case, just I'll set it to be 1 minute, since writing a file shouldn't really take that long. But of course, you have to kind of tweak this out within your kind of own context. So usually we don't recommend giving timeouts larger than, let's say, 120 minutes, so 2 hours. But in most cases, the sub-process or the remote calls should take at most a couple of minutes. And if they start taking longer, you are maybe doing something kind of too much in that sub-process component. So you might be trying to make the sub-process actually too complicated in that case if it starts taking too long to execute. But of course, those are kind of like just outliner situations. So you always have to be kind of look at that kind of on a case-by-case basis. But basically, after we enable the remote call and we say the timeout we want now this main process to wait until the execution has been kind of successfully completed, we now also need to tell for all of the different environments, how do we want to now configure our kind of remote call here. And what that means is that, because of course now if we only had our production environment with a single agent in all of the locations, it would be super straightforward. But because we're also supporting in Frends the different sort of environmental split up between the agents. So we could say that a single agent is running in a development environment, and then a couple in test, and then a couple in production. That means that we actually need to now tell this component, so the create new dad joke component, that's actually I want this part of this mini service or sub-process execution to write the file. That should always happen on Asmon Kotikone in the testing environment, no matter how many other agents there are. It's always happening on Asmon Kotikone, since that's the place where we can actually access the directory where we want to write our file. And in a production environment, I would have to, of course, also specify an agent where the execution will happen. So there in the production environment, I'm going to actually select the ground prod agent group. And a good thing to note here that you can also, of course, have only a single option there. So you might say that, all right, in development environment, we don't do the transference of the data using the service bus queue. So we don't actually execute the hybrid call when we are running this process in the development environment, and only in test and production environments, it's actually doing the hybrid call. So in the development environment, it's just always executing all of the functionality of the process locally, but then in test and production, we now enable the hybrid execution and choose the target of our components, and we choose which agent the execution should happen into, or the execution should be transferred to and to be executed then. But all right, if we're fairly happy with our kind of hybrid call here, let's call it a hybrid call to write dad joke, let's call it something like that. And what we then of course need to do is then just get our dad joke from somewhere and pass the data to our hybrid call to write our dad joke in the on-premise setting. So the most straightforward thing to do here is actually, I'm just gonna search for an HTTP request task, and I know the address is gonna be icanhasdadjoke.com, and I'm just gonna go ahead and put that there in the URL. So we're gonna be doing just a simple get, an HTTP get to the address to get our nice dad joke that then we'll be writing to a file. So I'm gonna do again the same thing. So I'm gonna test this out, and I'm just gonna run it on the actual machine or actual agent that we're gonna be using to run the kind of example once we're finished, and just see what sort of data we're getting back from our icanhas dad joke execution. Oh, actually, yeah, that's sometimes happens, but let's just run it again. It should be fine, and we should be able to get our result back here and see. So yeah, now we actually see that, okay, it took 203 milliseconds, but actually what we got back here is now not actually the dad joke, but the HTML representation of the dad joke site. But that's fairly easily solvable. So we of course don't want to start parsing through here and try and find out where the actual dad joke is under here. So we can actually just add a header called accept and call this text and plain. So what we're telling now the icanhasdadjoke.com is that please don't send us the HTML, but instead just send us the dad joke in text and plain format. So if we try that again, and after adding the header there and seeing if we can get our dad joke back, now we just basically only get the dad joke in this sort of a plain text version, which is now much simpler for us to use. So what we want to be doing then is, if we know that this looks something that we actually like, so we're getting the dad joke, perfect. So what we want to do then is of course add the header here to our task configuration as well, so our configurations match. So that means that we are gonna be telling these to accept text and plain also. And if we now are happy with the way that we can get our dad joke, and we can see that the dad joke is now in the result and the body of the get our dad joke execution, then of course what we want to be doing is passing that same dad joke to our file contents here, and that happens using the same curly bracket notation, the low code notation that we use in Frends. And under the hashtag, we can go into the result and get our dad joke result there. And now we just simply want to say that, all right, if we're now kind of parsing here, so we're basically navigating at this point now here, and if we add the body, that means that now we navigated from here to here. So this will be the data that will now actually be mapped to our file content. So the content of our dad joke in this case. And what we want to be doing next is generating some sort of a unique file name for our dad joke to be written in. And what I'm going to be doing here is I'm going to be combining a couple of different things. So I'm going to call my file dad joke underscore, and I'm going to use the same low code curly brackets notation of Frends to actually access the process context that we're executing this process in. And I'm saying that actually from the process context, I want to actually get the execution ID, which is actually a unique graphical UID that's attached to this execution of the process. And you can actually use that to track down the process that we ran this execution, or which actually now generated our dad joke. And the reason why I'm doing it like this is it's a good practice here, in especially in many file integration cases, to somehow leave a link to the Frends execution that generated the file, either in like the file metadata or even in the file name, like we're doing here. So whenever, if later down the line, if I have my nice dad joke library and someone is wondering, like, I wonder where this dad joke came from, then they could use the execution ID in the file name to actually come back here and track down the actual execution and see where the file was actually being generated originally. And after that, I'm just going to call it .txt, or maybe we should call it something funny like .joke as an example. So we're building our joke database in this case. So just to recap here a little bit before we actually start or run through our example here. So what we did, we created a sub-process here, which is now managing the way that how we are writing our file. And just as a reminder, of course, you can do anything here. So you could do REST requests, SQL queries, all of the standard French integration functionality is available for you to implement here. But in our case, we're just simply using a single task to write the file in a specific directory of our choosing. What we did afterwards is that when we packaged that as a kind of a sub-process execution, we told that sub-process that, all right, the time you have to try and write the file is 1 minute, and in the development environment, you don't execute a hybrid call, or you don't do this sort of a hybrid integration, but in test and production environments, you always execute it either in an Asmon kotikone in test environment, or on the ground prod agent on the production environment. And then we simply got our data from some endpoint or integration functionality. And in our case, it was the dad joke. And then we're just passing the dad joke to the sub-process component, which is then actually doing the hybrid call and transferring the execution there. So if we're fairly happy with our example process here, I'm just going to create a new process and activate it. And we can get the kind of similar, just a standard process here, exactly like we did with any other process. But now we also actually see, we can have the list there and see that what are the kind of sub-processes that we are utilizing in this case in our, or so what are the kind of hybrid calls that would be utilized here or here in the different process. And of course, you're allowed to have multiple hybrid calls. So if I wanted to, I could actually now do this thing in parallel, and I could actually maybe even do something like this. So if I have my component to write my dad joke to a file, and I've now specified that to be on the Asmon kotikone, I could also actually call the same sub-process twice and actually have two hybrid calls of the same component going on at the same time. So I could also say that, all right, actually, I want to distribute this file to both, let's say, Cloud Test Agent and Asmon kotikone. So now and also what I could do is I could do that to Cloud Prod and Ground Prod. So now I'm able to actually kind of distribute the execution or distribute the data using two of these hybrid calls in the same process, or 3 or 4 or any number that you actually want to. And of course, they don't even have to be the same sub-process. I could also do an SMS alert or any other functionality that I wanted to in my main process here. But for our example case here, we're just going to be doing the simple write a dad joke to a file only once here. But a good thing to note here is that now that we've created our functionality here, we are still only in the development environment. And what that means is that because we configured for our hybrid call that in the development environment, we don't want to execute, so we don't want to go through the hybrid execution or the hybrid call. If we run our integration here in the development environment, that's really not a good example, because nothing will happen. It won't be able to do the hybrid call. So instead, what we should be doing is now taking our process here and deploying it somewhere where we want to actually test it. So either in the testing environment or production environment, and I'm going to choose the cloud or the cloud test environment to now actually start the execution and have the execution pass now to my local PC here to do the file writing portion of that process. And what we're going to be doing here is actually seeing here also that we're requiring a sub-process component. And where if I click here, deploy and activate triggers, there will be a red box here in just a few moments, because that's going to be an error that will tell us that actually you are not allowed to deploy our example demo hybrid dad joke to file process, because I have not deployed the sub process component. So I haven't deployed the kind of target of the hybrid call to that environment. So what that means actually, that before we do the deployment for our first version of the actual kind of main process, I need to go into the sub processes and actually take our file create new dad joke mini service or sub process component, and that now we're actually seeing which processes are using it, and I need to deploy that with a specific version to now Asmon Kotikone. So now the agent, which is actually running here locally on my own PC. So let's see the services list here. So the Frends agent I have running here, that will now actually get the kind of dedicated part of the integration code that it needs to do the creation of the dad joke, and will actually, when I do the deployment now, then the agent will be able to actually subscribe to the internal queue, where we can now actually start sending messages from multiple locations. And then the agent will be listening in on that queue and will be able to start the sub-process execution, or the mini service or sub-process that we configure to actually do the writing of our dad joke. And I'm just going to go ahead into the Asmon Kotikone here and just check out that we correctly have our create new dad joke as an example here. And the cool thing here to note as well is that now that we have it deployed here remotely on this agent, I can also just kind of test it out. So I can manually try and run it, for example, with the default values here once, to see that everything should if everything is working and fine. And actually I can see that it was green. So that means that, yeah, we got our dad joke unique ID document here. And that means that now we can kind of also send those same messages which start the remote execution, not only from the other agent, but of course manually here from the UI by basically saying the run once. So I'm sending exactly the same message to that agent as the other agent would be when we're actually running the whole process there. So if we now jump back into our existing example here to create our new dad joke. So I'm just going to take that now, and now that I have my Asmon Kotikone, oh, actually I forgot to jump here on the processes side of things. So there we have our demo hybrid dad joke to file, and I'm going to deploy that one now to Asmon Kotikone, and now I can still see that, yeah, it's still using the sub process which we just tested, worked out brilliantly. So let's just deploy and activate triggers. Now it went through, so it didn't complain to us that we still need to have the additional sub-process component there available. And that basically means that, and actually I made a mistake here, because I don't know if you notice, we're still in the Asmon Kotikone instead of the cloud test, because now if we wanted to execute this locally on my PC, the whole process, that would of course be possible, but that wouldn't now demonstrate the hybrid capabilities, because it wouldn't actually utilize the queue there, since it's all running on the same machine here. So actually I need to tweak this out a little bit, and instead of deploying that to the Asmon kotikone or my home PC here, I'm gonna deploy that to actually the cloud agent in Azure and run that there. So perfect. Now we actually have our demo hybrid dad joke deployed on a completely remote agent in Azure Cloud, and we know that it's now actually calling a sub process which is located at Asmon kotikone. So we can see now here that we actually have a configured hybrid process now. So we can see that which is the kind of components we are utilizing and where they are located, because of course I could have other locations than my PC here for the hybrid calls as well. But just to kind of run through here, let's just run this once. So plop it going and actually go ahead and see what happens here. So let's go inside the execution here and first verify that we actually now create our nice something dad joke unique identifier joke file, and we can actually, let's open that up and see that in Notepad, and we have our nice dad joke here. What do you get when you cross a rabbit with water horse hairspray? So funny. But just maybe to kind of go through this from the process perspective. So we of course have all of our standard monitoring functionalities of Frends, so we can see that here's our dad joke we actually wanted to run through. And here's the interesting bit now that we actually are kind of passing the data between two different agents here, like we saw previously, and we actually can kind of see here that the agent which now ran this kind of, or was in charge of the whole instance. So the agent that was in charge of the execution was now the cloud test agent. But if we go to our hybrid call, we have the button to actually now jump into the hybrid call execution, and we can now actually see that it's linked now to a parent process. So we can see the parent process where we ended up in the hybrid call here. So in the file create new dad joke portion was the demo hybrid dad joke to file main process. And of course, you can have multiple hierarchies. So you can utilize sub-processes which call other sub-processes, which call other sub-processes. So if you want to create this sort of a hierarchy, that's in no way limited, but of course you should keep in mind to keep things as simple as possible whenever that's the case. But now here, of course, you can see that we have the cloud test agent, which was in charge of the whole instance. And for this hybrid call, we actually now jumped to Asmon kotikone and the PC there. And we can actually see here that the file name we configured was the dad joke there, and the file content was the dad joke, or for the hairspray dad joke. And then we wrote that in successfully in 3 milliseconds to temp in, and our dad joke file name. Well, the size in megabytes is 0. I guess it's too small to actually round up to even a single megabyte there. And of course, then we just return back to the main process some of the information. So basically, the result of the last step of our execution there. And of course, now we can jump back into our main process here also. But basically, now we are in a situation where we can actually, in the cloud, so let's go in the cloud test here, we could set a schedule as an example to our process here. So I'm just going to set this to be repeated every 5 seconds. And what this will actually mean is that now, after I deploy it to our cloud test environment, the cloud agent will every 5 seconds now actually get a new dad joke and start actually putting in dad jokes to our dad joke library until we're happy that we have enough dad jokes. And we could actually just run a few of them here. So actually start a couple of them and see with how many dad jokes we end up here. So all of this should be happening in relative real time, but there is slight delay when I'm actually now running it. You can see that it takes it takes like a half of a second or something like that. So that's good to note here, that even though the performance is really good when doing these sort of hybrid calls, so and you shouldn't definitely ever be afraid of using a hybrid calls, you can see that it still took 148 milliseconds for the hybrid call in total to execute, even though writing the file only took 5 milliseconds. So that means that there's actually a good 100 millisecond kind of a delay there when kind of going to on-premise and then getting the response back. And that's something that you, of course, kind of have to take into account when building these solutions. And of course, where does that come from? That's mainly 90-80%, that's network latency when I'm moving now the execution actually from the Azure cloud to my local PC, and the network latency that we have there in place. And that's something that you should, of course, now when designing these processes, kind of take into account, that you don't by accident implement kind of a solution which is super time critical, because if you do many of these in a series, of course the durations will kind of add up in that case. But it's almost like doing a kind of a web service call. So if we kind of compare that to the web service call where we're getting our dad jokes, it's in the similar category, because it's just passing the data between two different execution points, and that's why it takes a little bit longer. And just finally here, of course, now we kind of went through the monitoring portion, so we can actually jump back and forth between our kind of dad joke example there. But also what we can do is we can monitor from the kind of PC's perspective. So I could not utilize the main process there, but I could actually go ahead and see the execution of the or execution lift of the sub-process component, and kind of see who has actually now called my sub-process, because now I might have multiple parent processes which are consuming the same dad joke component here. And if you remember, like in the beginning, we ran it once manually, then of course we don't have a parent process because I just started it manually. But I could have multiple different endpoints consuming and calling the file create new dad joke component remotely here. And we have, of course, the option of actually jumping into any of these and seeing what's happening here. And we can even backtrack to the parent execution. So we can kind of come from top to bottom or bottom to top to try and kind of navigate the hierarchy between the hybrid calls and the multi-cloud calls that we can enable here. All right, but we are almost out of official time, and we kept a pretty tight schedule. I'm fairly happy about that, and probably I should actually turn the schedule off here, because I don't want the agent to actually start filling my. Let's deactivate that. Filling my my PC with a whole bunch of different dad jokes, but hopefully this has been rather interesting. And as always, you can view the recording of the webinar on our documentation page later if you need to get a recap. And hopefully this has been interesting and you learned something new. But thank you for now, and just tune in for the next webinar in a month or so.